take a deep breath. Now, imagine stepping back 4 billion years and doing the same. It would be your last. You aren't being hunted by a predator, you're being dismantled by the air itself. From planet-wide suffocation events to the day, oxygen became a catastrophic poison. We are deconstructing the lethal atmosphere that shaped the history of life. We view the air as a passive constant, but it is an unstable chemical system that has repeatedly turned against the biology it sustains. During the earliest eons, the sky hung as a heavy, sulfurous shroud that would instantly sear human lungs, while the ground teemed with microscopic life built on an entirely alien biochemistry. How did the first organisms endure a world that lacked the very element our cells now require to burn fuel? The answer remains locked within the volcanic gases that defined the infancy of our planet, and we must journey into deep time to understand why the air constantly transformed. The composition of those gases remains the primary mystery, dictating the geochemical boundaries of the earliest biological experiments. We are tracking a planet that was not merely cold or lifeless, but chemically hostile to the molecular foundations we rely on today. The atmospheric pressure and the exact ratio of volcanic output against the stripping power of solar winds acted as an unforgiving filter. What we see in the geologic record are the scars of these ancient struggles, traces of minerals that could only have formed in a world devoid of free oxygen. To reconstruct this, researchers have looked to the very core of the planet's formation. This leads us back to the dawn of the crust itself, the moment when the Hadean and early Archean eons transitioned from a molten chaos into a distinct atmospheric reality. From the crust's first stabilization, the atmosphere hardened into a furnace of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and sulfur dioxide. This was not a stagnant shell, but a volcanic exhale that countered heat loss with raw chemical power. These gases formed a caustic layer that actively corroded exposed minerals. Without an ozone layer, brutal ultraviolet radiation slammed into these gases, forcing molecular bonds that rarely occur in modern biology. This bombardment kept the surface in constant, aggressive flux. We see the scars of this reactivity in the oldest mineral records, where specific sulfur isotopes confirm the atmosphere's volatility. Beneath this haze, the chemistry of the planet was setting a rigid ceiling on existence. The puzzle now shifts to the Archean, where the margin for survival narrowed to an almost impossible limit. The atmosphere was largely devoid of free oxygen, with levels registering less than 0.001% of today's concentration, and in some segments of the era, 0.0001%. For any organism dependent on modern respiration, this absence is not merely an inconvenience, it is a fatal void. Without oxygen to drive the cellular machinery that powers movement, repair, and growth, complex life would face total, immediate shutdown. The Archean surface was a realm where the chemistry of air acted as a rigid filter, excluding all but the most specialized anaerobic life forms. These microbes existed in a state of metabolic suspension relative to our own, utilizing simple primitive pathways that required no gas exchange systems. Yet the constraints of this anoxic vacuum were not the only threat lurking in the stagnant air. Even as life struggled against the near-total lack of oxygen, the very composition of the atmosphere began to shift, masking a deeper, more volatile danger. A faint young sun delivered roughly 30% less heat than our modern star. By all physical laws, Earth should have been a lifeless marble of ice. It evaded this collapse only through a dense, heat-trapping shroud. Methane levels sat at hundreds, sometimes thousands of times higher than today, while carbon dioxide concentrations surged tens to hundreds of times above our current baseline. This chemical blanket acted as a critical planetary thermostat. Without this heavy cocktail of gases, the liquid water needed for life would have vanished into a permanent, global deep freeze. Yet this reliance creates a critical gap in our understanding. If the early sun was so dangerously dim, what geochemical engine sustained these volatile greenhouse levels for billions of years, and how did this thick, shifting haze behave when the crust itself began to vent its fury? The planet's tectonic furnace recycled crust, continuously venting sulfur and carbon compounds that functioned as a chemical thermostat. But this system was inherently unstable. Without an ozone layer, intense solar radiation bombarded the upper atmosphere, shredding simple molecules into highly reactive, unstable states. This perpetual chemical workshop fragmented atmospheric gases into radical, volatile forms that would be instantly toxic to any modern cell. These reagents rained into stagnant, shallow basins, creating a saturation of raw, reactive material. As these compounds reached critical density, the environment sat on a knife edge. The very substances that rendered the air a hostile barrier were simultaneously concentrating the building blocks required for complex carbon chains to knit together. These caustic pollutants were drifting toward the first fragile mechanisms of biological assembly. Yet the first chemical steps toward life may have begun in ponds enriched by another lethal agent. As these caustic pollutants drifted toward the first fragile mechanisms of biological assembly, a radical chemistry began in the same shallow ponds. Around 4 billion years ago, hydrogen cyanide fell from the sky, a molecule so toxic to modern cells that it triggers instant metabolic collapse. But in the high-energy environment of the early Earth, this lethal poison acted as a molecular bridge. It provided the critical carbon and nitrogen architecture required to synthesize amino acids and the essential building blocks of nucleotides. The planet used this harsh toxin to forge the very template of life. If hydrogen cyanide served as the architect of early biology, how did the surface maintain the heat necessary for these chemical experiments, especially when the planet was perpetually losing energy to a significantly dimmer star? The answer lies in a high-stakes geochemical gamble. Because the sun burned 30% fainter than today, liquid water should have locked into a permanent frozen tomb. Earth evaded this fate only because its atmosphere acted as an insulated furnace. Methane and carbon dioxide, accumulating at concentrations up to thousands of times our modern levels, trapped enough infrared radiation to force the planet to retain heat. This dense, reactive blanket functioned as a planetary thermostat, keeping the surface warm enough for chemistry to persist. Without this specific, thick cocktail, the surface temperature would have plunged, ending the cradle of life before it could gain momentum. Yet, this chemical stability was fragile. The very atmospheric gases protecting the planet were about to be triggered into a sudden, irreversible collapse. This greenhouse buffer was a fragile mask, hiding a volatile secret brewing within the oceans. Deep within the Paleoproterozoic, a biological coup began to rewrite the fundamental chemistry of the world. A silent revolution took hold roughly 46 billion years ago, where simple, single-celled cyanobacteria began to manufacture a molecule that served as a fatal environmental error. They exhaled oxygen as a metabolic byproduct, a gas that immediately began to chemically alter the seawater. The oceans, once a stable sanctuary for anaerobic life, started to saturate with this new gas, creating a mounting tension between the ancient residents and an emerging corrosive force. But why would the release of a gas now essential for most complex life trigger the most severe ecological catastrophe in our planet's long history? That contradiction sits at the heart of our next investigation. The answer lies in the cellular machinery of these ancient pioneers. For billions of years, life had thrived in a world devoid of free oxygen, building metabolisms shielded from the reactivity of this gas. When cyanobacteria began churning it out, they were not creating a fuel source. They were excreting a metabolic trash. The damage began in the shallow basins, where these colonies clumped together in vast mats. Oxygen is a highly reactive molecule, prone to stripping electrons from other compounds. And as it flooded their immediate environment, it triggered a lethal oxidative stress. It began to tear apart the delicate proteins and membranes of neighboring cells, forcing them to either evolve defensive enzymes to neutralize the poison or vanish from the fossil record entirely. The atmosphere was turning into a planetary-scale oxidant, and for the dominant life forms of the Archean, this shift was the ultimate structural failure. Oxygen molecules aggressively tore electrons from vital organic compounds, effectively sabotaging the metabolic networks that had sustained life for eons. For these anaerobic organisms, the gas acted as a lethal reactant, systematically unraveling the cellular machinery required to generate energy. This internal catastrophe, now categorized as oxidative stress, meant the atmosphere itself began to corrode their internal structures from the inside out. Microbes were forced to either synthesize defensive enzymes to neutralize the corrosive threat or succumb to total systemic failure. As these anaerobic pioneers vanished from the fossil record, a profound imbalance rippled through the planetary climate. The atmosphere was turning into an oxidant, and as the oxygen levels rose, it began to systematically dismantle the gases that had kept the world warm. What happens when the very air that sustains life also destroys the planet's greenhouse blanket? The cooling of that greenhouse shield reveals a darker reality, a molecular assault on life. Oxygen is a high-energy oxidant. For an anaerobic microbe, it acts as a relentless corrosive, systematically unraveling the delicate proteins and fatty acids that maintain cellular integrity. This was a biological slaughter. As free oxygen saturated the coastal shallows, the molecules infiltrated every pore of the microbial mats, triggering reactions that degraded these ancient organisms from within. They possessed no evolutionary defense against such intense oxidative stress. Survivors retreated into the deep, dark pockets of the ocean floor, fleeing surface waters that had become a fatal hazard. This transition triggered a chilling paradox. The loss of those heat-trapping gases invited a global freeze, setting the stage for a transformation that would grip the planet in a permanent white silence. This chemical reaction systematically dismantled the planet's insulation. Methane, the robust greenhouse blanket that kept Earth habitable under a sun 30% dimmer than our own, was scavenged by the rising tide of free oxygen. As these molecules collided, methane converted into carbon dioxide and water vapor, gases lacking the heat-trapping efficiency to maintain a liquid world. The thermal defense that held the Archean climate steady for eons suffered a catastrophic failure. Earth's ability to retain solar energy collapsed. Temperatures plummeted, turning equatorial zones into landscapes of encroaching ice. The byproduct that heralded a metabolic revolution was now architecting a planetary deep freeze. The globe stood on the threshold of a descent into a crystalline, frozen silence. The planet turned into a crystalline tomb. For 230 million years, the Huronian glaciation locked Earth in a grip of ice. This wasn't merely a cold snap. It was a total breakdown of the insulating blanket that had protected the biosphere since its inception. By stripping the sky of methane, this new, invisible reactant forced the surface temperatures into a terminal nosedive. Glaciers surged from the poles, crushing the shallow basins where life had once thrived, turning oceans into stagnant, slush-filled voids. Yet, in this absolute stillness, a fundamental question emerges. How did the fragile microbial machinery survive a global freeze that threatened to snuff out the spark of life entirely? Could these early organisms have found a refuge in the extreme, or did the very chemistry of this icy, hostile environment force them to adopt new, more resilient strategies? Isolated in geothermal pockets, life fractured. As the surface turned to ice, these microscopic refugees clung to seafloor vents, severed from the wider ocean. This confinement acted as a rigorous biological crucible. Without sunlight or oxygen-rich currents, survivors shifted to processing volcanic sulfur compounds, repurposing them as primary energy sources to withstand the deep freeze. The fossil record preserves the chemical signatures of these adaptations, marking a pivot toward specialized enzymatic functions required for stability in a cooling world. This metabolic innovation was not merely a survival tactic. It was a desperate evolutionary redesign under extreme pressure. But this forced change suggests a brutal toll. How many dominant anaerobic lineages were erased during these 230 million years of ice? And what would it take for the remaining survivors to reclaim a warming planet? The answer lies in the deep sea dark. While the surface world locked tight under ice, survivors retreated to hydrothermal vents. These rifts continued to spew sulfur-rich plumes, fueling a localized chemosynthetic economy that rendered sunlight irrelevant. These vents became an evolutionary crucible, forcing rapid metabolic adaptation as survivors learned to harness chemical energy from sulfur compounds. When the Hadean glaciers finally retreated, the microbial life emerging into the shallows had been rewritten. They were now hardwired for the higher yields that oxygen-based respiration provided. This internal upgrade turned the planet's rising oxygen from an existential threat into an engine for rapid diversification. The atmosphere stayed in stasis for 1 billion years, waiting for the next shift. This internal upgrade turned the planet's rising oxygen from an existential threat into an engine for rapid diversification, leading us to the Carboniferous period 350 million years ago. The atmospheric composition then tilted into a realm no living thing had encountered before. Oxygen, which had spent eons struggling for dominance, hit 20%, levels familiar to us, then continued a relentless, unchecked climb. Within 50 million years, this gas accounted for 35% of the total air. This was a radical departure from the long, oxygen-starved stasis that defined the previous billion years. What forces prompted this sudden, unchecked saturation? And as this volume grew, what were the visible biological and environmental tolls of living in an atmosphere that was literally becoming more flammable by the day? The answer lies in the volatile chemistry of the Carboniferous landscape itself. When oxygen levels hit 35%, the planet crossed a combustion threshold where the air functioned as a literal accelerant. In this hyper-oxygenated environment, even saturated forest floor peat became tinder. Once lightning struck, it did not merely flicker, it detonated into ferocious wildfires that raced across continents. These infernos incinerated vast ecosystems within days, fundamentally resetting the biological clock of the world. This brutal reality forced life into a permanent cycle of rapid growth and sudden extinction as the landscape became a recurring trial by fire. Yet, this high-stakes atmospheric instability masks a deeper mechanical paradox. For the survivors, the intense concentration of oxygen provided a massive, unintended physiological subsidy, providing the precise fuel source required to bypass the limitations of size and reach the scale of monsters. This metabolic bounty triggered an explosion in biological scale. In the damp, swampy thickets of the Carboniferous, the high partial pressure of oxygen acted as a mechanical bypass for the respiratory limits of land-dwelling arthropods. Without the need for power-intensive circulatory pumping, oxygen molecules simply diffused deeper into internal tracheal networks. This enabled the rise of giant dragonflies with wingspans reaching 2 feet and 6-foot-long millipedes prowling the forest floor. The air functioned as a biological scaffold, inflating life beyond its typical structural limits. Yet, this abundance carried a volatile debt. The same gas that fueled this gigantism saturated the forest debris, creating a geochemical powder keg. Every acre of peat stood ready to ignite in an atmosphere primed for instant explosive combustion. Even the rain failed to quench the scale of these infernos. Lightning didn't merely strike, it acted as a detonation trigger across thousands of miles of coal-forming swamps. These fires were not isolated accidents but essential components of the ecosystem's carbon cycle, rapidly cycling matter through a hyper-oxidized atmospheric system. The intense heat-fused plant matter into coal seams we see today, effectively burying the atmospheric surplus and locking away the planet's carbon in solid form. Yet this intense geological cleansing couldn't last forever. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian, the atmospheric mechanics shifted from oxygen-driven combustion toward a far more insidious threat. The tectonic machinery of the planet began to stir, preparing a new, toxic cocktail that would soon rewrite the rules of existence in a way fire never could. The planet's tectonic engines aligned for a multi-million-year assault on the atmosphere that eclipsed the oxygen-fueled fires of the previous age. At the center of this transition lies a singular, brutal geochemical pivot point. 251 million years ago, the Permian-Triassic extinction, the Great Dying, decimated life on a scale unseen before or since. Unlike the cold glaciations or the slow rise of photosynthetic oxygen, this event was a chemical bombardment. A massive surge of volatile compounds choked the troposphere, driving temperatures upward and effectively dismantling the ozone layer. But what geologic mechanism could sustain such a concentrated release of poisons for long enough to erase 96% of marine species and 70% of vertebrate life on land? The clues lie in the fractured crust of a continent now long gone, and the specific composition of the gases that bubbled up from the subterranean depths. The subterranean engine of this catastrophe was the Siberian traps. For 2 million years, tectonic rifting tore the crust, allowing colossal volumes of basaltic magma to surge toward the surface. This was not a localized eruption but a flood basalt event covering millions of square kilometers in molten rock. As the magma punched through massive coal and carbonate deposits, it baked the strata, cooking organic matter into gases. This thermal reaction injected trillions of tons of carbon dioxide and sulfur-rich compounds directly into the stratosphere, bypassing the normal planetary cycles that might have otherwise buffered the change. The heat alone was immense, but the chemical shift was lethal. With the atmosphere now thick with these volcanic pollutants, the stage was set for a secondary, more insidious phase of the collapse. The sulfur, rising as vapor, began a silent descent that would rewrite the chemistry of the rainfall itself. This sulfur, rising as vapor, reacted instantly with atmospheric moisture to drench the continents in the concentrated sulfuric acid. This was not a localized disaster, but a corrosive blanket that stripped the land of its protective foliage and turned thriving forests into sterile, blackened skeletons. With the canopy gone, the exposed soil, stripped of its roots and binding strength, was scoured away by violent storms, surging in lethal loads into the dying river systems. This massive loss of vegetation fundamentally halted the natural carbon sequestration process, leaving the atmosphere to swell with unchecked gases. But even as the land burned and washed away, a far more catastrophic transformation was accelerating beneath the waves. where heat and darkness were brewing a new, invisible menace. This heat, trapping sunlight behind a thickening veil of carbon, triggered a global fever. As mean surface temperatures climbed, they did more than warm the planet. They slowed the churning of the oceans. The circulation patterns that once delivered life-sustaining oxygen to the deep abyss began to falter, causing the seas to stagnate. This climate-driven instability prevented the cold, oxygenated water from reaching the depths, creating a stagnant pool where organic matter could no longer decay safely. With the ocean's circulatory engine locking up, the water columns stratified, trapping heat and locking away the oxygen needed to support life. This was the opening of a lethal feedback loop, a warming, dying sea primed to host a new, unseen menace lurking in the dark layers of the sediment. The deeper the water becomes, the more the chemistry turns hostile. In the stagnant, light-starved depths, the lack of oxygen prevents organic matter from breaking down naturally. Instead, this accumulation of dead material provides a perfect rotting buffet for a specific class of sulfate-reducing bacteria. These organisms thrive in the suffocating silence, processing the sulfate in seawater and shedding a toxic, gaseous byproduct. It is a biological process that flips the chemical rules of the environment, poisoning the lower depths from the seafloor up. As these marine zones grow, they move like a silent tide, rising toward the surface to claim more territory. But this suffocating transformation triggers a much more lethal transition, one that threatens to bring the ocean's invisible poison directly into the open air. These microbial colonies thrive where light cannot penetrate, shifting the chemistry of the deep. In these oceanic pockets, bacteria thrive not on oxygen, but on sulfate, metabolizing the abundant sulfur to fuel their survival. This biochemical shift turns the water into a toxic, purple-green mire, dense with hydrogen sulfide. Unlike the oxygen-starved zones that merely suffocate, these liquid layers are chemically weaponized. As they expand, they strip the water column of its ability to support life, creating a volatile, invisible boundary between the habitable shallows and the lethal depths. The stability of the marine food chain shatters. But the true threat lies in the upward migration of these sulfide-rich plumes. The oceans are no longer just a barrier to life. They are becoming a pressurized vessel of concentrated, rising poison, poised to breach the surface and alter the chemistry of the world above. As the oceans lose their final capacity to sequester sulfur, the water-air interface shifts from a boundary into a conduit. Hydrogen sulfide, a gas lethal to animals at concentrations above 500 parts per million, begins to outgas directly into the atmosphere. A single breath at 1,000 parts per million triggers instant loss of consciousness, paralyzing the central nervous system and silencing cardiac function. Once this toxic plume breaches the surface, it does not dissipate. It blankets the lower atmosphere in a colorless, volatile shroud. This mechanism poses an existential challenge. If the very air becomes a poison to every vertebrate on land, what defense remains against the chemical legacy of the oceans? The answer lies in the total, unchecked saturation of the world below during the Great Dying, where the atmosphere and the sea fused into a singular kill zone. This sulfurous fog did not stay contained within the waves. As the oceans turned into stagnant, toxic mires, the hydrogen sulfide migrated upward, breaking the surface to saturate the air with an invisible death. The transition was total. Where oxygen had once fueled life's expansion, this new chemical vapor became a lethal barrier that no terrestrial creature could bypass. The scale of this outgassing dwarfed any local pollution, effectively turning the planet's base layer into a chemical hazard zone. As the gas climbed through the troposphere, The consequences shifted from simple biological suffocation to a deeper, more structural catastrophe. The chemistry of the skies began to fracture in a way that threatened the very shield protecting life from the sun itself. The H2S gas attacked the ozone layer itself, carving a hole through the planet's only natural defense against solar bombardment. With this protective barrier stripped, radiation that had been filtered for eons hit the surface at lethal intensities. Life on land now faced a double siege, a toxic atmospheric blanket that choked internal chemistry, and an invisible high-energy surge of ultraviolet rays that shattered DNA on contact. The sky wasn't just poisonous, it became a magnifying glass for the sun's most destructive wavelengths. This atmospheric stripping removed the safety margin that had allowed life to colonize the continents. As the ozone integrity collapsed, the final transition from an ocean-based crisis to a total planetary collapse accelerated, setting the stage for a loss of life so severe that the foundations of the food chain were fundamentally erased. The total loss of terrestrial biodiversity hit 70% of vertebrate species, while the marine wreckage eclipsed 96%. This carnage was absolute. Species that had occupied the planet for millions of years simply vanished, their lineages severed by a combination of toxic gases and rapid-fire climate volatility. With the land scorched by acid rain and the shallow oceans turned into hypoxic pits, the basic building blocks of complex ecosystems simply stopped functioning. The food chains that had taken 500 million years to assemble were dismantled in a geological blink. Yet, amid this total planetary collapse, a strange pattern began to emerge in the fossil record. Where one might expect to see a void of silence, we instead find the first stirrings of a radically different biological future, one that seemed to defy the toxic conditions of the time. What could have allowed for such persistence after such a total erasure? The key to this resilience lies in the subterranean survival of specialized microbial communities that thrived in isolated, chemical-rich refugia long after the surface had been scorched. As the Siberian traps cooled, the atmospheric chemistry began a slow, stuttering recovery. Volcanic emissions waned, and the chaotic cycle of sulfuric acid rain gave way to a thinner, more predictable sky. The first dinosaurs emerged into this fragile, warming world, flourishing in an environment where carbon levels were still high enough to support rapid plant growth, but low enough to avoid a runaway greenhouse state. These creatures didn't just endure the aftermath of the Great Dying, they radiated into the ecological voids left by the mass extinction. By adapting their metabolisms to a new atmospheric baseline, they set the stage for 100 million years of dominance. Earth was not just recovering, it was recalibrating for a new, more complex era of biology. As the dust settled on a ruined world, the atmosphere began its next long-term transformation. By the time the Mesozoic era arrived, the air had shifted into a composition that would trigger a physiological crisis for any mammal. Carbon dioxide levels climbed steadily, ranging from 2,000 to 4,000 parts per million, with some geologic spikes reaching as high as 6,000 parts per million. To grasp the severity, consider our modern threshold. Current concentrations are barely 420 parts per million. At the Mesozoic's elevated levels, human cognition would falter and respiratory function would face constant, acute strain. Yet this air was not a toxic shroud for everyone. The planet was entering a cycle where high carbon, greenhouse-heavy conditions defined the very survival of the Titans about to inherit the land, creating a profound mismatch between their atmospheric environment and our own. Millions of years later, the Mesozoic sky presented a different challenge entirely. Carbon dioxide climbed to between 2,000 and 4,000 parts per million, spiking as high as 6,000 in some intervals. against a modern baseline of barely 420. For the dinosaurs, this was not poison but fuel. Dense, high-carbon air drove the lush vegetation that fed the largest land animals ever to walk the earth. For a modern human, the same air would be a slow burden. At several thousand parts per million, rising blood CO2 dulls cognition and brings on headaches and heavy fatigue. The truly acute effects arrive only at far higher percent-level concentrations. The titans thrived in an atmosphere our own cells are built to reject. This is the deepest lesson of deep time. The word breathable is not an absolute but an evolutionary accident. What one epoch's dominant life treats as a life-giving fuel, another perceives as a lethal contaminant. Anaerobic microbes were poisoned by the oxygen we cannot live without. The dinosaurs flourished in carbon levels that would leave us gasping. Life does not inhabit a fixed environment. It is continuously retuned to whatever chemistry the planet happens to be running at the time. Our comfort with the current air is not a birthright. It is a narrow adaptation to one brief chapter. We can reconstruct these vanished atmospheres because the planet keeps meticulous records in stone. Banded iron formations mark the moment oxygen first rusted the oceans. Distinctive sulfur isotope ratios reveal skies that held no oxygen at all, and later skies choked with volcanic sulfur. Mercury spikes buried in sedimentary layers pin down the precise pulses of flood basalt volcanism that triggered the great collapses. Read together, these chemical fingerprints let geologists date each crisis and measure how fast it struck, sometimes revealing shifts that tipped the world from stable to lethal in mere decades, not millennia. And buried in that same molecular record sits the final, startling twist of our origin. Those toxic hydrogen cyanide ponds were never dead-end vats of poison. The very carbon-nitrogen bonds in cyanide supplied the scaffolding for nucleobases, the structural blueprints of heredity itself. A molecule that kills modern cells by halting respiration was the precise trigger for the first replicating biology. This is the great paradox of Earth's chemistry laid bare. The substances most lethal to life today were the same catalysts that first constructed it. Seen across 4 billion years, every atmospheric upheaval functioned as a brutal filter. The shift from methane to sulfur to oxygen metabolism did not merely test life, it rewired it. Cells that could not reconfigure their internal chemistry were erased from the record. The survivors were those that learned to feed on the new waste, turning each planetary poison into an energy source. Oxygen, once a mass casualty event, became the high-yield fuel that powers every complex organism alive today. The biosphere we inherit is the residue of that winnowing, forged in an atmosphere that was never designed for us. Our own equilibrium is startlingly recent and startlingly precise. Human physiology is tuned to roughly 21% oxygen. Drift far enough below that, and cognition falters as it does at altitude, while sustained levels far above it turn oxygen slowly toxic to lung and nerve tissue. Combine that with our low tolerance for carbon dioxide, and modern humans occupy one of the narrowest habitable windows any dominant life form has ever needed. For most of the history of complex life, this exact air simply did not exist. That reframes our place on the planet. We are not the masters of this atmosphere, but its temporary tenants, riding a specific, transient balance that the Earth has assembled and dismantled many times before. The nitrogen-oxygen mixture in your lungs is not a constant of nature. It is a passing phase in a violent 4 billion-year cycle. Every mass extinction preserved in the rock is a quiet reminder that a breathable sky has never been guaranteed for long, and the machinery that rewrote the air in the past has never left. The vast reservoirs of carbon and sulfur that fueled the Great Dying still lie sequestered beneath the crust. The ocean chemistry that once bred rising sulfide still operates in the deep. When those buffers failed during the Siberian traps, The climate flipped from habitable to lethal in a geological heartbeat. These are not closed chapters of history. They are dormant processes, waiting on the same volcanic and biological triggers that governed the planet long before we arrived. The air itself is a library of every crisis Earth has ever survived, and its next chapter is already taking shape in the rock. Every breath you take is a veteran of that 4 billion-year struggle, a chemical souvenir of a world that turned its own poisons into the fuel for life. Join us again as we continue exploring the deep history of our planet and the forgotten forces that made a lethal world into the only home we have ever known. Subscribe for more journeys into the worlds that were.